I'm pleased to introduce Kimberly Peyton. She is an estuary biologist with the Division of Aquatic Resources and has worked all throughout our main Hawaiian islands and estuaries. So with that, I will stop sharing the results and pass it over to Kim.
Oh, thank you, Kim. So I'm going to be talking about the estuaries of Hawaii in relation to the non-native fishes that have invaded these sites. The co-authors on my talk are the two Troys from the Big Island, Shimoda and Sakihara, as well as Skippy Howe from Maui. We all work at the Division of Aquatic Resources, and the funding for this comes from the Dingell-Johnson Sport Fish Restoration out of the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the state of Hawaii. So estuaries form where there's salt and freshwater mixing. And you can see in here, this is east and west Wailua Iki, that's on East Maui. You can see the stream mouth estuaries of the two streams coming into this bay. So this is 3 different estuaries. These are also areas for juvenile fish habitat. One of the things that's really unique about the Hawaiian estuaries that people don't think about too often is they're the most isolated set of estuaries in the world. Here we are out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Our estuaries are fed by fresh water sources that come from both surface water, this is the streams, as well as coastal groundwater. So if you think about some of the coastal groundwater only sites, that would be the east side of the Big Island. Now, estuaries are at once freshwater as well as marine ecosystems. They're also aquatic and terrestrial. And in this simple slide here, you can sort of see this captured with the water chemistry. Right here, you see the salty Pacific Ocean, low in nutrients, higher in pH, and higher in temperature, coming in and mixing with the tannin-stained waters, freshwater, which is lower in pH, a lot higher in nutrients. And the tannins, of course, are coming from land plants. So you can see the aquatic mixing, the influence of the land and the ocean, and this is what creates our estuaries here in Hawaii. Now here I'm going to attempt to show you some drone footage. I was told it might be a little bit of buffering, and I do apologize for that, but it helps to show what some of these estuaries look like. This is Honumanu on the east side of Maui. You can see the orographic rain in the back falling on the mountains and the stream in between the valleys. Now this is a stream mouth estuary. Notice how quiet the water is. It's a little bit murky. Now we're entering into the stream mouth, the transition between the stream mouth estuary and the bay estuary. Notice how the wave motion picks up. So we've got quiet water and rougher water. You've got clearer water coming in. Also, you notice on either side of the stream, there's the coastal wetlands. You can even see a little taro lo'i that the Hawaiians are converting now. Of course, all that is formed by invasive vegetation. And as we pull out even further with the drone, you start to see the deeper water and clearer water. If you look at this is juvenile fish habitat. Look at all the micro habitats available for these fish. Remember, these fish are coming in from the plankton. They're settling out as coastal species for the first time. Their idea is to grow as fast as they can. They need different food sources and much of the food sources in order to get to the larger sizes. And as the drone swings around, you begin to see the close proximity of adult habitat in many of these cases. You see now a lot more wave motion, clearer water, deeper water. You begin to see the corals underneath there. And that, of course, is the adult habitat. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the results that we're getting from our CastNet surveys. We do different types of surveys in the estuaries to get at the information that we need to get at. But today I'm just going to summarize the CastNets. We use a 1/4 inch iCastNet. We do that because it's kind of like throwing a baby blanket over these fish. The idea is to count the fish, identify them, and measure them, and then put them back into the ocean safely so they can grow up further. Now, why do we do this? Well, first of all, to better manage these fish, we need to know a lot more about the time they spend as juveniles in the estuaries. And if you think about it, if the fish can't survive through their juvenile phase in the estuaries, then why would we expect them to reach legal size for sport fishing? And this is in fact why this project is funded by Dingell-Johnson. But this is, of course, in an invasive species session. And so we'll be talking a little bit about the results of our sport fishing sampling, but I want you to think a little bit about the impacts of invasive species and potentially the impact of invasive species on the sport fishing. So here are our study sites throughout the main Hawaiian Islands. We have 2 over in Kauai, and then the rest of the islands, we have 3 sites in each one of those. The fish that we sample, they weigh about 10 grams on average. That's the weight of 2 nickels. Of course, we get some smaller and some larger individuals, but that's about what we're targeting with a 1/4-inch eye cast net. Now here's some summary data, and I'll just walk you through this. We have to give averages here, and that's because on the island of Maui, the estuaries are much smaller than the other islands. And so we don't throw as many cast nets, and we sample a smaller area. So to be fair to Maui, we give you the averages of the sampling over the last 3 years. Now, one of the things to look at is looking at the number of fish that we get. And if you notice, Hawaii Island is a little bit lower than, say, Oahu, and so is Maui. And you may be a little bit concerned about that and say, well, is that possible that, Hawaii Island and Maui, those estuaries don't carry as many fish as Kauai and Oahu, maybe because of the condition of the estuaries isn't as good? And that's certainly one thought and one hypothesis that we can test. But our research that we're doing at Division of Aquatic Resources is some of the first to be done on estuaries across the state in total. And so we work with a lot of different theories. Another theory we have is simply this. These are the 2 youngest islands, and so the estuaries aren't mature enough to support as many fish as the older islands. So that's another way to look at that. So those are some of the research questions that we're asking. Another thing to note, I think, is that the island of Oahu, with most of the population and most of the pollution and most of the pressures, supports amazingly diverse and productive estuaries. So these are some of the findings that we're going to have throughout our study. Now, I won't talk too much about native species here, but I did want to give a shout out to them because we're going to focus only on the invasives today. But I did say we've got predators in here, we have flatfish, we have herbivores, as you can see here, and also front and center always will be the aholehole. That's Kulia zanura. That's a species that's found across all of the, just about all of the estuaries that we sample, and it's our top in, native species, although there's great diversity in the native species that we get. Now, what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to pool all of those sites that we sample together into a simple pie figures here, as you can see. So this is all of the estuaries pooled together. And what we're doing is we're just going to go and compare how many native species, how many native individuals did we sample versus the introduced species. And what you can see here is about 50-50 in 2017, 18, and 19. And now what we're doing there is we're just counting up the total number of fish that we caught through this 1/4-inch eye cast nets, but half and half. Now, the other way we can look at this, and particularly because we're looking at juvenile individuals that are growing in size rapidly and changing in size, is we also look at it in terms of biomass. We're not just counting the number of individuals, but looking at the weight of them. And for this, we don't weigh every single fish. We just use a formula that we developed at the division for calculating the size of a fish. If you know the species and the size, you can calculate the mass of that fish or the weight of that fish. So we asked that same question, 2017, 18, and 19, what proportion of our total catch across the whole state are introduced species versus native species? And again, we're getting about 50%. Now, I'll stop for a minute here and tell you a little story. When I gave this talk on the mainland in the conference right before we got the COVID shutdown, I asked people in the audience, these are professionals in the estuary world as well as fish world. I said, has anybody ever seen these kind of numbers in an open system? I mean, not a lake or a stream, things like that are closed systems, but an open system, which an estuary is considered an open system, meaning open to the ocean. And these are this international audience. No one ever seen these kind of numbers before. And this is statewide. So this is something that's truly stunning. Now, I'm only going to be talking about invasive animals. A quick nod to the fact that our estuaries are also invaded by plants, fringing plants along these wetlands. And you can see here, this is the California grass, and that is, of course, mangrove, all imported and brought into the state. This is beautiful Anahola stream on Kauai. Now, the introduced animals run a gamut through here. We've got a lot of tilapia. We also have the tadpoles of the cane toad. People don't always know that these are very salt tolerant tadpoles, believe it or not. So they do invade the estuary. Of course, the Samoan crab and ta'ape, bait fish, all sorts of things coming in, and the Condor mullet, which we'll talk about a lot more. So where did our individual animals come from? Where do these invasives come from in the estuary? Well, it turns out we have animals from all over the world that have successfully invaded the estuaries of Hawaii, including Africa, the Indo-Pacific, where you'd expect, as well as the Americas. But if we compare that to the coral reef, the coral reefs of Hawaii have only been invaded by animals from the Indo-Pacific. So we have a great evolutionary diversity of our invasive species in our estuaries. Now you notice that there's two slices of the pie, a little bit unusual, the Marquesan Islands as well as Nicaragua. And that's because a couple of those species are endemics to those regions. So they're only found there. They were brought to Hawaii, introduced, and they've successfully established here. So that's a little bit different. Another thing to look at is to ask, well, were these primary introductions, meaning did they come from the original place that these species are found, or are they secondary introductions? And it turns out most of our introductions in Hawaii are secondary. So as I mentioned before, we've got a number of species from Africa that have come in and successfully introduced. But what you can see here is we've had no direct introductions from Africa. Instead, they've come from Singapore, for example, or other places, which means that, you know, the individuals that got to Hawaii were toughened up. You know, they were raised in tanks, they were raised under really tough conditions, and they came all ready and fit to establish themselves in Hawaii. So that's another thing to consider. Now let's take a look at where in the areas where these fish came from, their native habitats. What were they listed as? Freshwater, marine, or brackish water? And we've got a diversity of all three that have established in our estuaries. We've got things that in their native range are known only to be freshwater, and yet they've established successfully in our estuaries. The same thing, listed only as marine, but they can handle our estuaries and brackish as well. Now, another way to look at this is to ask, well, what about the feeding guilds that these different fish come from? And what we have in our introduced fish in the Hawaiian estuaries is a good assortment of different feeding guilds. So we've got predatory fish, at least that's what's listed in their native range, those that feed on plankton, herbivorous fish, as well as omnivores. So if you think about these fish coming in and establishing themselves in the Hawaiian estuaries and thinking about what possible impact could they have in the estuaries, one of the things they can do is compete with food for our native species. And so what you can see here is we got a good diversity of competition for food with our native fish in these estuaries. So that's, of course, very concerning. Another thing we want to look at is that we ask, when did these come in and why did they come in? So most of them came in after World War II, you can see right here, and they were brought in intentionally. Now, I showed you in the beginning how isolated we are, and that isolation has led to a lot less species making it to Hawaii. And so we tend to be what they call depauperate in certain types of fish. So shallow water snappers, for example. So the thinking at the time was, let's improve the Hawaiian species by bringing in other species from elsewhere. And that's what they did. And a lot of them have established. We've also had some aquarium releases, that tends to be the more recent introductions. And then of course there's some incidentals. And that happens when you're bringing in an intentional species, and then in that shipment of these little fish is some other species. And they recognize, for example, oh, they don't belong in that shipment, but they get all the way here, let's just release them. And that's actually the story we're gonna start to tell about the Condor mullet. That came in with a species of bait fish brought in to improve Hawaiian fisheries with their bait fish. The guys recognized that, yeah, that's not that targeted one, but it's mixed in, and they released it. And here's the story. So in these pie charts, this is now only looking at that half of the pie chart I showed you originally, which had native versus invasive. Now we're going to drill down and just look at, of the introduced species that are here in Hawaii, what is that made up of over the last 3 years? And this is, again, statewide. And you can see one fish overall in the brown dominates, and that's the Condor mullet. That's that incidental fish they never intended to bring in for any purpose, but it was mixed in with the bait fish, and they introduced it anyway, and look at what's happened. That doesn't matter if we look at in terms of counting the number of individuals or looking at the biomass. Same answer. The Condor mullet for the last 3 years has really dominated the system. And actually before that, we were well aware of this fish. Now it's important to look at both abundance and biomass when it comes to the Condor mullet, because this is one of those species that comes out of the plankton as juveniles, settles into an estuary, and then stays for its whole rest of its life, adult existence. They may go out to spawn, but they always come back as adults. So we've been really keen about this species. Now, I'm not going to show you all of the study sites and the results from that. I'm just going to look and focus on 2 of the study sites, and those are over in East Oahu and East Honolulu is what I meant to say. And that's between Cocoa Head and Diamond Head, Mauna Loa Bay. And we're going to first look at Pico Lagoon results. And Pico Lagoon is in Kuli'o'o, part of Mauna Loa Bay. And this is looking at biomass right here. And this is us going out once a quarter and looking at the proportion of the catch that we get and looking at the numbers and the different species. Okay, so Pico Lagoon is a waterbird sanctuary run by DOFA, the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So what you can see in the orange, the #1 species that we get, and all except for this quarter right here, is the Condor mullet. So, and then you can also see in blue, this is the Oama. Now that's one of the native mullets that are here. And then you can also see the tilapia in gray. Now, I'll take a quick note about the tilapia. The tilapias that are in Hawaii, that have invaded Hawaii or introduced here, they're mostly from Africa. And in their native range in Africa, they are fed on by, or their main predator are water birds, because they live in shallow water lagoons over there. So the water birds scoop down and pick these up. So these tilapia are really adapted to looking above them for shadows that might come over the top of them, such as a water bird. So they'll really swim fast when one hint of a shadow goes over the top of them. So you have to understand that what does a cast net look like, but a giant water bird, right, coming over the top of them. So there's probably a lot more tilapia in this system than what we can catch with a cast net. But that's part of sampling with fish. There's always going to be some biases in your results. But certainly, it's not going to change the fact that there's still a lot of Condor mullet at the Pico Lagoon. Now we're going to move a few miles towards Diamond Head in Mauna Loa Bay to Guadalupe. And Guadalupe is much more of a base site with a small stream in front of it. And this is going to be a 2-part figure. I don't want to crowd too many species on here, and I could extend this figure out with time, but this is just a quick chunk of what we're getting. And the 2-part figures, because we get a lot more species when we work out in Guadalupe than we do at Pico, where I just showed you. And again, in orange is Condor mullet, pretty much our #1 species out there. And this is in biomass. But here's the 3rd mullet species now. This is the wowo, and that's in gold. And you can see the wowo numbers are pretty good most of the time as well. Now it's important to note the big difference between the wowo, the Condor mullet, and the Oama is that the wowo in the estuary, those are only juveniles. So wowo is the surfing mullet. So that's the one you're going to find in the surf zone. People don't always know that one as well. But so we're only small individuals. So if we did this, if I happen to do this by abundance, these numbers would probably look a lot higher. And remember, it's competing with the Condor mullet that's there for the whole, for we've got juveniles through adults. Another thing that you're going to see, of course, is things like the juvenile goatfish, Oama, throughout there, that everyone that fishes knows they come in big numbers at different times. Here's the second part of that figure. Again, looking at some of the other possible invasives, and that's again where tilapias show up. But again, with the caveat that we know we're probably undersampling this invasive. And you can see our #1 fish, our #1 native fish, if you looked across all the islands, would be a hole, as well as the Oama coming in. And then we also have juvenile manini and the iao, of course. Now, we don't really want to talk about these species in terms of saying, well, here it is, we're in bad shape in the estuaries, what can we do about it? So we've known through other different sampling methods that the condom mullet, this one right here, is a problem. And so we kind of put our heads together, and Troy Shimoda was able to write a really great article a few years ago for Hawaii Fishing News, where we thought if we could explain to the public and the fishermen how to tell these three mullets apart. We know they look kind of similar, you know, but if we could tell them apart, then people could go out and they could fish down the condom mullet because there's no season to it. Take as much as you want. It's a perfectly edible fish. And so in his article, he described the difference between these three species, and as well, he even provided some cooking suggestions for this. So I thought that was great. But what happened was one of the fishermen over in Molokai read the article, and he was out fishing, and he found the condom mullet, and he threw the others back, and he was walking back, and he got stopped by our doe care officer, our conservation officers, one of them over there, and he said to him, "You've got some illegal sized mullet there, and you got to throw them back." And he said, "No, no, no. I read an article in Hawaii Fishing News, and Dar taught me the difference between the three different mullets. This is the invasive mullet." And the conservation officer said to him, "Well, I can't tell the difference, so you have to throw it back." So of course he called our office up. He was, you know, pretty upset about this, but he inspired us to think even deeper about how we can work with the public and the conservation officers. So our next solution at DAR was to come up with these mullet rulers. And this is one of our approaches to this, is show the difference between the three mullet. This is the front of the ruler. This is the back of the ruler. Now they're color coded. At the base of this fin is blue for the ama, yellow for the wo, and no color for the condom mullet. Now, there is some regulation, of course, on the ama. The legal size is 11 inches. You've got a closed season and a bag limit, but that's only in hilo. These other two mullets you can take year round at any size. There's no restrictions on them. So that was the first thing, is to try to, you know, encourage the fishing down of the condom mullet. Now, we've had some fish pond operators reach out to us and ask us, well, I've got a bunch of conda in my fish pond, you know, can I use them as a fundraiser, cook them up and stuff? I think, yes, absolutely. But I do advise any fish pond people, just make sure that you talk to doe care before you're going to do that, to let them know this is what you're doing, because once they're cooked, it might be a little bit harder to tell them apart, or a lot harder to tell them apart. But I think if you make doe care aware, you should be all good. So we certainly encourage, take as much of this conda out of the system as you want. We do, I know in the time of COVID, we can't always get the mullet rulers out, but we do have a handout that's online at this link. When I downloaded the link, I thought, wow, that's a really intense link. That's really a long link. So I think if you just Google ama and Hawaii, this link will come up in one of your top selections, and then you can just download it from there if you need to. Now, what else can we do? Well, we've also thought a little bit more about improving our research on this species. Now, for example, this species occurs in Australia, but it turns out that the Australians know nothing about it. In fact, when I give a talk and there's an Australian in the audience, they'll raise their hand at the end and ask me, bloody heck, Hawaii, why did you ever bring that fish in? You know, it's not that great of a fish. And I always have to tell them, well, it was incidental. We didn't mean to, but it's here and it's established in these high numbers. So one of the things we went ahead and looked at was, well, what's happening with this fish in Hawaii? So the first thing you want to do is, well, ask, what about its life history? It turns out nothing is known. Like I say, the Australians are not that interested in this fish species. So we did our own life history study in collaboration with Conservation International and the UH. And what we found was that at about 6 to 7 months, the condom mullet is reproductive. So it's sexually mature and it's spawning. We also learned that they spawn year round. And if we compare this to the ama, they're spawning only between December and March. So we've got a year-round spawner and a seasonal spawner competing, right? The next thing we looked at was the age at spawning. How old are these conda when they can start to be reproductive? Turned out about, like say, 6 to 7 months. And for the ama, that was about 3 years. We knew that from the literature. So again, you've got something that's spawning in the matter of months, something that's taking years. So no wonder they're outnumbering these two species. The third thing we asked was, what is the age of the Condor mullet? How long do they live in our system? And it turned out they only live about, we didn't see too many individuals above 14 months. And that was a real surprise. And we collected fish from both Big Island as well as Oahu so that we could kind of spread it out and be sure of our answer there. And that's what's really maybe interested some of the Australians, because we'd like to know, in their native range, do they live that short of a life? Or is there something about Hawaii where they're introduced that shortens their life? And if there is, what is it? And how can we make this fish even more uncomfortable? We would like to shorten its life and compress it down to whether it pretty much disappears from our system. So that's some of the current work that we're trying to think about. And you also might say, well, you didn't say anything about the wowo life history. That's because we don't know anything about it, even at the level of the genus. So that's one of the other projects that we're working on at the Division of Aquatic Resources. We should have that done in about a year. So thank you very much. I'll just end the talk now by reminding everybody that if you want to have sustainable fishing, you really need to rely on healthy estuaries. I'm not sure how healthy an estuary is if half the fish in there are invasive species competing with our native species, but it's part of some of the work that we're doing. So thank you very much.